Hello, hello, and welcome back, chat, to the Chipped Cup Cafe. I'll be your barista and narrator for tonight, I suppose. Moka Kahvesi, but you can just call me Moka. So, it's been a while since we've done one of these, and we'll be doing another, or rather, we'll be continuing where we left off from Legends and Lattes. Just a bit of a recap for new viewers who might be popping in at this point in time of the series. It's a very nice, cozy story written by Travis Baldree. I link his Twitter in the chat, but I guess I can do that later. And it basically follows our protagonist of the story, an ex-adventurer named Viv, as she decides to put up resign or retire from the life of an adventurer to put up a small cafe in the big city. And it just revolves around her sort of trials and tribulations in trying to put up and maintain this very small, cozy slice of heaven she has. And she makes quite a few friends along the way. A rat baker, I'm not even joking, probably one of the cutest things. Also, hey, welcome. For those of you who don't know, chat, Hey is my mod and my partner. So be nice. But yeah. So it revolves around Viv and her making new friends. Sort of like a halfling carpenter, a rat baker, a couple of other friendly neighbors as well. So we stopped at around chapter 21 last time, which is about a month ago. So we'll be picking up from there. We'll probably go on until maybe 10:30, 10, or about at least an hour and 30 minutes. I've got my tea ready, I've got my water ready as well. And yeah, I guess we can start now. So let's go over here. Legends and Lattes, a novel of high fantasy and low stakes, by Travis Baldree. Chapter 21. Viv and Tandre moved through the morning routine, easing around one another with low murmurs, careful not to touch, each exquisitely aware of the space the other occupied. Viv acted with unthinking economy, brewing, serving, greeting, and registering very little. Neither of them noticed Thimble's industry with his new cookware and ingredients until the smell of melting chocolate permeated the shop. At a tug on Viv's shirt, she looked down to see their baker anxiously clasping his flour-caked hands together. Oh, hey Thimble. On the back table, golden crescents cooled in neat rows atop several racks. Thimble selected one and offered it to her. She took it with a nod. Flaky and yellow, the pastry's buttery layers folded over in gentle curves. The smell was gorgeous. She took a bite that almost melted in her mouth, at once rich with butter and impossibly light. Comparing these to a loaf of bread was like comparing silk to burlap. This is incredible, she managed. It was so good, in fact, that she only hesitantly followed up with, but this can't have, what was it? Chocolate, supplied Tandre, as she pinched off another corner and popped it into her mouth. She made a small sound in her throat and closed her eyes as she chewed. Thimble made a get on with it gesture with his hands, his impatience evident. Viv shrugged, took another bite, and found a molten core of chocolate inside. The taste was nothing like what she'd sampled yesterday. Sweeter, deeper, richer, creamy and decadent, with subtle spice. Also, just wanted to check chat. Is my audio okay? Like no echo, not too loud, not too soft. Would be a bit awkward if I started talking since earlier and turns out that my mic was muted. I don't think it's muted. At least I don't think it should be. Yeah, it's definitely not. Okay. Well, let's get on with it then. Wait, how's Thimble? She managed. Her mouth sang with the flavor of it. How do you keep doing this? She stared at the pastry in surprise, and then immediately had another bite. Viv glanced over to find Tandri transfixed, chocolate smearing her lips, eyes huge and luminous. Thimble, you might not know this, but that is, we, Tandri's tail swept in a head-to-toe gesture. We respond strongly to all kinds of sensations, including taste, and, well, we've experienced that warm pulse again, and Thimble must have too because he blinked and shivered. Whatever this is, it's just about incapacitating. The succubus sighed appreciatively. You were right before, Thimble, said Viv. You've got to get you a bigger kitchen. Tandri considered the available space. 2 stoves? Push out the wall? I'll ask Cal. Viv glanced back at their chef. In the meantime, what do you call these? She polished hers off, licking her fingers for every last tender flake and chocolatey smear. The ratkin shrugged and took one himself, testing it with a squeeze and nibbling one end. Leave it to me, said Tandri, around another huge bite. She approached the menu and added, right underneath Thimble's, midnight crescents, buttery fold over with a sinful center. 4 bits. The quiet tension between her and Tandri had evaporated, and Viv almost thought she'd imagined their hazy morning dance. Thimble's crescents predictably sold out within the hour, and he was already at work on a new batch. Viv preoccupied herself with the restrictions of their small kitchen. What might Cal suggest, once she had the chance to ask for his thoughts? She kept glancing at the auto circulator above, thinking that the answer might be nothing that she expected. The usual hem, she asked when he stepped up to the counter. Hemington leaned closer. I do wish you wouldn't call me that, he said in an undertone. She smiled, her eyes on her work. Is that a yes then? What I wanted to say is the ward is nearly set. And yes, an iced coffee, please. Oh, it is? On the house then. It should cover the premises and a few additional feet in a rough circle. How will I know if it's gone off? That's the last detail. He held his left hand out on the counter. Yours, please. Viv didn't hesitate. She placed her much larger one down, mirroring him. He tapped with the first 2 fingers on his right hand on his left, and made several curling gestures and complex twists. The blue light flared. Before the glow faded, he touched palm to palm with Viv, and there was a brief fizzing, like beer bubbles against one's lip. That's it? She asked as he broke contact. That's it. If the ward is triggered, you'll feel a sort of gentle tug in that hand. It should be enough to wake you. A gentle tug, huh? Now, bear in mind, the ward only functions once. I'd have to reset it if it were triggered, but, well, there it is. One should be enough. She slid his drink across to him. Thanks, Hem. He opened his mouth to object, but shook his head instead. You're welcome, Viv. He nodded and took his drink back to his table. What was that about? Asked Tandri. Just a little insurance. Oops. Sorry, I just had to drink some water. The following afternoon, Pendry reappeared in the shop, this time with his original bizarre loot. Viv nodded encouragingly, glad to see him. So, he said, I'll stop if you don't like it, or if anyone complains. He sucked his breath through his teeth, as though bracing for a blow. It'll be fine, kid. Here, start with one of these. She handed him a midnight crescent, and he took it with a confused look. Pointing to his instrument, Viv said, Also, I have to ask, what exactly is that? Oh, this? Well, it's a thermic lute. It's, well, the sort of, new. He pointed at the grey slab with silver pins beneath the strings. See, the auric pickup sort of gathers in the sound as it, when the strings vibrate, there's an, Actually, I don't know how it works, he finished lamely. It's alright, said Viv and waved him in. Knock 'em dead. Figuratively, please. Blinking, he wandered into the dining area while taking a tentative bite of the pastry, and Viv smiled. No sound arose for several minutes, and she figured he was finishing his food. Then she forgot about him as a line of customers formed out in front of the counter. When he finally began to play, she glanced up in surprise. The lute wailed that same ragged, buzzing tone, but the music he played was more delicate than before, subtly picked with the slow lope of a ballad. An additional presence underpinned, as though the notes reverberated in a larger space, with a thicker, warmer feeling. Also, she could swear the result was quieter than his first aborted attempt. Viv didn't know much about music, but now that she'd grown used to the kid's occasional visits, the leap to this confident modern sound didn't seem so far anymore. He'd been bridging the gap this whole time, and taken the obvious next step. Pendry's altogether unexpected style was right, especially here. She and Tandri exchanged bemused smiles. Viv noticed that Tandri's tail was subtly, metronomically swaying behind her. Viv figured that was endorsement enough. As the week wore on, Viv lived in constant anticipation of phantom tugs at her right palm. Hemington had explained that it would be gentle, but she imagined it as a fishhook embedded in her flesh that would yank sharply, jerking at her hand. Nothing happened, though. Her skin tingled as she envisioned it, but eventually the feeling of wary expectation faded. Lainey dropped by with increasing frequency, making many offers to trade recipes with her baker. Viv always deferred the thimble. The little old woman's exasperation with its gestures and anxious blinking left Viv both amused and a smidge guilty for foistering her off on him. She also thought his hand signals were at their most cryptic only when confronted with Lainey. The old woman always bought something, though. The dire cat appeared with more regularity. Viv sometimes felt the prickle of Amity's regard and turned to find her perched in the loft like a sooty gargoyle, surveying the diners with disdain. Tandri tried using treats to tempt the animal into claiming the bed they'd made for her, but Amity only ate them, made very deliberate eye contact, and sauntered away with her tail high. Viv discovered she didn't mind having a watchful monstrosity around. Not one bit. Viv and Tandri settled back into a comfortable equilibrium. There were no further picnics or walks home. Viv harbored a wistful ache that she didn't examine too closely, and an almost cowardly relief that Tandri didn't mention their evening at the park. They stayed busy, and the days brimmed with good smells and unexpected music and companionable work. Her hopes for the shop had been exceeded in every regard. That was enough, wasn't it? Tandri startled Viv by dropping some of her art materials on the table, including a bottle of ink, a slim brush, and one of the mugs. "I have an idea," she said. "I've been on TikTok too long. I'm just remembering that clip from I think it was the Kroogs. Oh, darn it, chat. Okay. Anyways, where were we?" Viv looked up from wiping down the machine. "I'm listening. So, I think about this a lot. My first drink, I have it while I work. I take a sip when I want, and I make my cup stretch through the morning. I love that." Viv nodded. "Yeah, sure. I do the same." "Your customers, they don't have that." "Our customers," said Viv, but nodded again. "Okay, I'm with you." "Well, what if they could take it with them?" "I've wished for that before, but..." She shrugged. "Never figured out a way to do it. So if you have... we sell them a mug, and..." She turned the cup. In Tandri's flowing script, she'd written Viv. "We have their name. They can leave it here behind the counter if they like, but they own the mug. They can be on their way with a drink in hand whenever they want. All they have to do is bring it back." "I think that's perfect." Viv rubbed her neck. "Honestly, I feel like a bit of a fool for not thinking of it myself." "You probably would have eventually." There was a warm pulse again, increasingly recognizable. Viv was suddenly awash in an old feeling of fraught potential, a critical instant that hinged on the movement of a blade, the placement of a foot, a moment of trust extended or withheld. Failure to act was as much a decision as any other. "You know, Tandri, this place is really becoming as much yours as mine. You're making it yours." Tandri looked dismayed. I'm sorry, Viv winced and scrambled to explain. "That's not what I mean. I mean, it wouldn't be what it is without you. I'm glad it's becoming yours, and I want to make sure you know that... She fumbled her words and fell silent. Into that confused pause, Tandri murmured, "You don't have to worry. I'm not going anywhere." Viv suddenly found herself lost and alone on a dark road, abandoned by whatever guiding light had led her this far. It's good, but what I wanted to say was, really, what did she want to say? Had she grown so complacent that she'd trust the outcome of this conversation to some mythical stone? Wasn't Tandri more important than that? Did she demand Viv's truest words, offered unambiguously? The darkness bristled with dangers, some perhaps even worth risking. Tandri straightened and forced a quick smile. "So, I'll just add this to the board then, alright?" That's... Yeah, we should definitely do that," Viv lamely replied. Tandri backed away from them both, and Viv couldn't decide if she was relieved or disappointed. There, Viv. We all get torpe sometimes. You gotta love a shy protagonist, you know, Chad? Oh, he's very cute. Okay. Chapter 22. Thimble squeaked for emphasis, pointing at the woodcut print in the gnomish catalogue Viv has spread over the countertop. The ratkin stood on a stool to get a proper view. The stove depicted in the advertisement was twice as wide as theirs, with dual extra-large ovens and fireboxes, and a back panel with temperature control gauges and knobs. We found it difficult to make out much detail from the woodcut, but the look was very modern, and the listed features set Thimble's eyes sparkling with longing. "You're sure?" She raised her eyebrows at the price. She'd come to Thune with a nice nest egg, but renovations, equipment costs, and specialty food orders had whittled it down. The beans she ordered regularly from Azimuth came dearly too. The new stove would nearly wipe out her remaining funds, although she was pretty sure they'd recovered in a few months, given the popularity of Thimble's baked goods. The ratkin nodded decisively, but at her expression, he hesitated, and then reluctantly indicated a less expensive model further down the page. "No, Thimble," she said, pointing at him. "Best deserve the best, and that's you. I'll have Cal make sure we can install it, and I'll put in an order." "Oh, that's sweet. That's wholesome." Her gaze snapped up when she heard a familiar voice speaking to Tandri. "Here for this week's delivery. And, let me see. One of the lattes, please, my dear." Black stood opposite, humming as he stared at the menu board. While Tandri brewed his drink, Viv retrieved the reserved sack of rolls from underneath the counter and, after a moment's thought, added 2 of Thimble's crescents as well. She gave the man a slight nod as he passed over the bag. "Let me know what the Madrigal thinks of this week's tribute." "I'll do so." Black returned the nod, accepted his drink, and went quietly on his way. "Yes, will there be music today?" The girl was young and looked a little breathless and windblown. "We're never sure," said Viv with a shrug. "Baldree comes and goes." Oh." The girl seemed disappointed, but covered it quickly. "Anything I can get you?" No, thank you." "So you don't know when he might be back?" Viv thought she was trying, pretty unsuccessfully, to downplay her interest in the answer to that question. Afraid not. After the girl left, Tandri arched a brow. That's the third one this week. Viv gazed thoughtfully after Pendry's admirer. You thinking what I'm thinking? You pin him down, I'll make the sign. The next time Pendry darkened the doorstep, Viv thought his bearing was a little more assured. He nodded cheerfully, comfortable enough to head to his impromptu stage without permission. Hey, Pendry, she said, catching him before he disappeared around the corner. Got a second? Sure. The old worry started to creep back into his expression, so Viv forged ahead. You still don't have your hat out for coin, do you? Well, no. I just like to play. It sort of feels like begging to ask. If my dad ever heard of me, he broke off, grimacing hugely. What if I paid you? More like a wage, maybe. He looked surprised. But why would you? I already... Well, I need you to be a little more regular, of course. Regular? Say 4 times a week, every other day. And at the same time, every time. Maybe 5 in the evening? 6 bits a session. How's that sound? Pendry looked disbelieving. Oh, well, you really pay me to play? Yep, that's about the size of it. She extended a hand. Yes, ma'am, he said, pumping it vigorously with his own. Oh, and Pendry, you should still put your hat out. By the end of the day, another sign hung outside the shop, painted in Tandri's flowing script. Live music, Mornday, Tauday, Vintus Friday, 5 in the evening. Oh, he's got his own little gig to play. That's sweet. Viv started awake at a painful tearing sensation in her right palm, the skin splitting and peeling away. She was up in an instant, the bedroll thrown open, searching her hand for the wound that must be there. Her flesh was smooth and undamaged. The feeling persisted, though, lacing up her forearm. Viv's instincts had not yet entirely fled her, despite months of inaction, and she lunged for Black Blood's accustomed resting spot beside her bedroll. Of course, it wasn't there, instead hanging uselessly on the kitchen wall, tangled in garlands. Hemington's Ward. Fennis. That elf must have heard her flinging the bedding aside, the creature of the boards, wasn't he? She crept to the ladder anyway, hunched and shifting her weight carefully from barefoot to barefoot. The tugging, ripping feeling in her hand abated. She heard nothing from below. When she peered over the edge, a scant bar of moonlight blued the dining area. The chandelier loomed almost in front of her face, and beneath she could see the softened silhouette of the big table, the dark slabs of the booth surrounding it, the sketchy strokes of the flagstones. Her night vision wasn't particularly good, but she held her breath, staring hard for any hint of motion. A minute passed, another. With the ghost of a scent, something foreign under the pervasive aroma of coffee. A faint but recognizable perfume. Floral and ancient. He was cloaked and hooded, but it was him. Not so much as the rustle of cloth betrayed his presence, but Fennis had always been impossibly stealthy, usually to the advantage of their party. Now on the receiving end, Viv marveled at his noiseless advance with a grim new respect. She had to squint hard to track his motion, but she saw him pause at the end of the big table, The glimmer of one pale hand appeared, gently resting on its surface. Sorry, had a cough there. The scalded stone lay hidden directly below, his head tilted inside his cowl, as though listening, or using some elven sense Viv didn't share. There's no point in waiting. She leapt, landing heavily. There was no point in stealth either. "Hello, Fennis," she said. He didn't even have the grace to appear startled. Turning smoothly toward her, he folded back his cowl, and a pale yellow light burst into being in his cupped left hand. His face was illuminated from below, as infuriatingly mild as ever. The elf nodded to her as though he were greeting her at his own doorstep. "Viv, I'm intrigued. Glad you heard me," he said in a tone that was anything but interested. There wasn't a shred of shame either. "Had a little help," she shrugged. "I don't suppose there's any point in asking why you're here." "Of course not, but I imagine the guilt has been preying on you." "Guilt?" Viv asked incredulously. "What in the eight hells do you mean, guilt?" The elf sighed as though her obtuseness disappointed him. "You didn't deal fairly with us, Viv. I had my suspicions from the beginning. You know, you were so evasive." "It was a fair cut," said Viv levelly, "especially for what amounted to rumor and chance." The Scalbert's hoard was plenty to balance the scale. "I don't agree," he replied silkily. She found his patient, reasonable voice incredibly irritating. Then his lips wrinkled in uncharacteristic annoyance. For the first time his mask of cold indifference slipped. "You were hardly subtle. All that muscle, not half the wit for guile. Was it taxing for you, the plotting and planning? Clever, Viv, untangling a fabulous mystery. Why, you must have thought you were the first. How amusing." And with the stone in hand, off he scurried as fast as he could, afraid you'd let something slip if you lingered too long, or perhaps the shame sent you packing. "Shame," Viv laughed. "You're full of shit, Fennis." "Am I? Tell me then, do the others know? That I made a fool's bet based on a few lines from a song? No, not because I was ashamed, Fennis. Embarrassed is closer to the truth." He gestured expansively at the building. "A fool's bet? It seems not." Viv ground her teeth. "A deal's a deal, and I kept my end of the bargain. You really need it, Fennis? What do you think it'll do for you? Are you defending a principle by creeping around in the night to take what's mine?" "A principle. Something like that," he murmured. His eyes flickered to her greatsword on the wall. "When you put that blade away, never believe you exchanged it for scruples." "I figured I've talked enough. Do what you're going to do, and I guess we'll see what happens." "Oh, Viv, it's a shame that..." Venice leapt suddenly, gracelessly backward as an enormous, sooty shadow lunged over the table, narrowly missing him with a swipe of fearsome claws. Amity landed with predatory grace and whirled on the elf with a hitching snarl. "Godspeed, damn thing," spat Venice. The dire cat stalked toward him with slow, deliberate steps, her muzzle bunched up above impressive fangs. Viv hadn't even known the beast was in the building. How had she missed her? Amity's growl throbbed louder, and then Venice ghosted past with a nimbleness even the cat couldn't match. In an instant, he was out the door and had vanished into the night. The dire cat stared after him for a moment, then lazily blinked her enormous green eyes. She padded back to the pillow and blankets in the far corner, circled on them, kneaded them with her claws, and then settled back down to sleep again. Viv cautiously knelt and stroked the big cat's fur. The vibration of her purr rattled all the way up to Viv's shoulder. When the 8 hells did you actually start sleeping here? She wondered aloud, and why didn't I see her before? Either way, Viv was going to make sure there was extra cream on hand, and maybe a nice joint of beef. Despite the sure knowledge that Finnis couldn't have disturbed the stone, he plainly hadn't had time. Viv couldn't sleep without reassuring herself. She checked up and down the street before shutting and relocking the front door. Pushing aside the table, she squatted and turned over the flagstone in order to stroke the scalpered stone where it lay. The shop, Tandre Thimble Cal, and now Amity, the way each week seemed to flower into the next, budding into the fulfillment of a heretofore unknown need. Up till this moment, speculation over whether her fortune was due to the scalpered stone had been almost academic. Why prod at a good thing too closely? Now the question seemed like it always should have been. What would happen if she lost the stone? If it truly was the root of everything she had grown, then if it were cut away, would the plant wither and die? Or would it continue on? And if so, for how long? She thought about the last few months, and she especially thought about Tandre and the Spartan room upstairs. Maybe her friend was right. Maybe the shop wasn't her life. Maybe she should be prepared to lose it. Without it, though, what was she really? She could only arrive at one answer. Alone. That was a pretty good line. Chapter 23. He was here, asked Tandre, in the middle of the night. They opened late, Tandre insisted. Viv said nothing at first, but the other woman quickly sensed that something was amiss, her innate talents at work, and demanded to know what was wrong. He came for the stone then. Did he get it? He didn't. Masaki was waited for her to elaborate, and when she didn't, Tandre slapped the palm on the counter hard. What happened? All of it. This time, please. So Viv told her in as much detail as she could remember. We should find a way to hide the cat too, muttered Tandre when she had finished. A leg of lamb in the cold box for when she shows up, said Viv with a faint smile. She was gone this morning. No idea how she got out. So this ward that Hemington sent, or set rather, it's spent now. We'll need to have him resetted. There's no point, said Viv. Candace won't try the same thing twice. It'll be something else. I don't know what, but I'll just have to be wary. I'm pretty good at that. At least I used to be. How far will he go to get it? Tandre asked, eyes narrowed. Honestly, I don't know. Further than this, though. Tandre paced the room, tail whipping from side to side, drumming her fingers against her chin. The stone, if it was gone, what would happen? I've been asking myself the same thing. I think we're at the point of assuming it works. Things have gone so well. And the madrigal seemed pretty sure of it. It's not like I have any basis for comparison, but still. What's the most you could lose? Viv stared at Tandri and didn't voice her first thought. Instead, she hedged. Oh, come on, Viv. I don't know. Maybe everything, maybe nothing. Maybe I should stow it somewhere else just to find out. Maybe I should throw it in the river and forget about it. She gave an exasperated sigh. Or maybe I should sleep next to my sword again. Stop it, Tandri said sharply. Self-pity doesn't look good on you. Viv grimaced. Sorry. Tandri stopped pacing and suddenly looked uncomfortable. And I think it may be a particularly bad idea to get rid of it anyway. What do you mean? The succubus sounded like she didn't want to answer, but then she relented. Well, there's a concept in thaumaturgy. It's called arcane reciprocity. That's why thaumaturgy is so controlled and why we don't use it in warfare, at least not to kill. She sighed. Are you familiar with the idea that when we treat pain with medicine, we're really just delaying it? Sorry, I had to fix my chair there. That when the treatment is done, you suddenly feel all that deferred suffering, like it was stored up for later. I've heard that, but I'm not sure if I believe it. I felt a lot of pain, said Viv with a wry smile. So, continued Tandri, in thaumaturgy, it's sort of like that, only measurable. An effect caused by arcane power has a reciprocal effect that is expressed when the power is removed. Everything has to balance out. Once the power stops, something pushes back. Advanced thaumaturgy is all about redirecting blowback. Then you think if a stone is taken away, maybe there's some sort of backlash, like bad luck. I don't know for sure, said Tandri. Is a stone even thaumaturgy? The same principles apply? She winced. It's just maybe a possibility, but if it's true, the real question we have to ask isn't how much there is to lose. It's how much more there is to take after that. Viv stared at Tandri and clenched her jaw. More than I want to give up. Oh, my heart. My kokoro. That was so sweet, though. Viv tried to think of some other place inside the building to store the stone, one more secure, but eventually resigned herself to the fact that it didn't really matter. If Finnis had found it in the first place, a new hiding spot wouldn't be a secret for long. Since she'd surprised him once, he'd assume his intrusion would be detected, so she couldn't imagine him creeping in at night a second time. She needed to figure out how he'd come at her next, or through whom. Waiting for a blow to fall was not something that Viv was used to. She'd spent a lifetime ending threats before they manifested, not bracing herself for a knife in the back. Constant wariness wore at her, and she became increasingly snappish and impatient. The first week was the worst, and she apologized more than once to Tandri and Thimble for being short with them. A few times, Tandri gently moved her aside and took over at the counter, when Viv didn't realize she was glowering menacingly at a customer. Viv was both embarrassed and grateful, but inevitably time dulled the edge of her anxiety, reducing it to the occasional startle at an imagined sound in the night and furtive glances towards the stone resting place throughout the day. At the same time, Pendry's scheduled performances became something of a pleasant hassle. A regular audience began to build for his appearances. Quite a few of the attendees didn't actually buy anything, but Viv was fairly certain that some of his fans were converting to actual customers. To manage, they sorted out a way to add overflow seating. Viv bought more tables that they stored in the alley on performance days. They set them in the street and threw the big doors wide. The kid, for his part, was slumping less, smiling more, and his bulk finally seemed to fit the space he occupied. Once or twice, Lainey made her way across the street to make a few tart complaints about the noise, but since they were usually delivered around a mouthful of thimbles baking, the sting was somewhat lessened. Amity even appeared during the performances, weaving between startled customers and settling beneath the big trestle table. Regulars learned to be protective of their treats, since she casually swallowed any unattended pastries in her path. Her lashing tail was a menace to mugs. Viv never once considered shooing her away. 3 weeks had come and gone since Venice's nighttime intrusion, and while Viv couldn't pretend that the threat had passed, she did relax back into her routine. Her mood improved, and she hadn't apologized for a waspish remark in a fortnight. Oh boy. Cal took to dropping in more regularly, and Viv caught him in huddled conference with Tawdry once or twice. He made a few loud, pointed observations about the quality of locks, and Viv assured him she'd look into replacements. When the Madrigal strolled into the shop, Viv stood open-mouthed for a second. "Good evening," the woman said. "Evening, ma'am," she managed. "Can I help you?" Viv had the good sense not to speak her name, at least, but ma'am, she cringed inwardly. The Madrigal's dress was understatedly elegant, and she carried a handbag over one arm. Viv spotted at least one of her men subtly shadowing her from the street. Wherever there was one, at least two more lurked out of sight. The woman's eyes glittered with cold, curious regard. Gods, what if I'd made an enemy out of her? Thought Viv. She could hardly believe she'd ever spoken so bluntly to her face. "I've heard so much about this establishment," the Madrigal said. "At my age, I don't get out quite as much as I once did, but the opportunity presented itself and I simply had to see." "Well, we try to make sure we're good neighbors," said Viv, asking as subtly as she could manage if there had been some misstep on her part. "Indeed, I'm sure you are. Not everyone is so neighborly, though, I fear, and that element can sometimes be quite tenacious." She pointedly held Viv's gaze, then crisply opened her handbag and reached within. "Ah, yes, and I'd like one of those crescent pastries, please, my dear." Numbly, Viv took the coins and handed over the fold-over, wrapped in waxed paper. She lowered her voice. "Tenacious." The Madrigal sighed, as though it was also disappointing. It would be such a shame if anything untoward were to happen to such an excellent neighbor. A touch of vigilance over the next few days might be warranted. It's my fervent hope that these worries of mine are misplaced, because... She took a delicate nibble of the crescent roll. "These really are quite excellent. Good night, dear." She nodded regally, turned, and left in a rustle of grey silk. Her man vanished from sight as well. Tawdry eyed the woman's departure with suspicion. Having caught the unspoken interplay, she shot a knowing glance at Viv, who subtly shook her head in answer. A sick feeling bubbled in her stomach. After closing, Tawdry finally asked, "Was that her? The madrigal?" "Yep." "She gave you a message?" "Yeah, more of a warning. I don't know why she bothered to let me know, but Venice is going to move soon." "And what are we going to do about it?" "Well, I could always kill him," said Viv. Tawdry just stared at her. "Joking, joking," muttered Viv. "Was she, though?" "The problem is I actually stopped to consider it," Tawdry confessed. "He is such an asshole." "After that big speech you gave a month ago? Yeah, well, nobody's perfect." Viv sighed. "Now we're back to square one, trying to guess what he'll do next." "No, we're not, because we know he wants a stone enough to come here himself. We can't be certain he'll try the same thing again. In fact, I can almost guarantee he won't." "Well," said Tawdry, "one thing is certain." "What's that?" "You're not staying here alone." "I don't know why you're still arguing," said Tawdry as she double-checked the locks. Up to her elbows in soapy water, Liv scrubbed rather aggressively at the mug. "It just doesn't make any sense. What difference could it possibly make for you to be here?" she grumbled. Light dimmed as Tawdry began extinguishing lanterns. "You're right. With Hemington's ward gone, what difference could I possibly make? I'm only gifted with exceptional sensitivity to human emotions across an unbelievable range. How on earth could that be of any use?" Viv set the mug down more forcefully than she'd intended. A crack splintered up the side and she gritted her teeth. "I still don't like it. Since you can't refute my point, I guess I don't care." Viv turned around to look at her, crossing her arms solemnly. "Don't be such a baby. We'll make a pact. If mortal danger threatens us, I promise to hide behind you. Deal?" Viv stared back, feeling increasingly foolish, until she relented with a sigh. "Deal." Exhausted, they stood together at the top of the ladder. "I thought I told you to buy a bed." Tawdry grimly surveyed the still barren loft. Viv had Amity's seldom-used blankets and pillow under one arm, while I was a little distracted, nighttime intruders and all. Tawdry rolled her eyes. "Give me that." She seized the bedding, shaking the dire cat hair out of the blanket and pillow before busying herself unfolding Viv's bedroll and assembling a larger place to bed down. Viv watched with a growing feeling of embarrassment and trepidation. "Well," said Tawdry, her hands on her hips, "at least with the stove running, it shouldn't be that cold. I can't believe you live like this." Tawdry really hit her with a "damn, you live like this." There, Viv. "I'll be fine, really. There's no reason you shouldn't sleep in your own bed." "Stop it. We already had that argument." After a moment's hesitation, she shucked down to her small clothes, slid quickly under the blanket, and turned her back to Viv. Viv extinguished the lantern and then did the same, tiptoeing as if Tawdry were already asleep. Then, snorting at her own ridiculousness, she pulled the blanket, still smelling strongly of dire cat, over one shoulder. Even with her back to Tandri, she could feel the woman's warmth. "Good night, Tandri," she said, too loudly. "Good night." Viv stared ahead into the darkness. "Is that your tale?" "I'm just getting comfortable." Tandri's reply was tart. After some strategic adjustments, she fell still. There was a long silence. Viv cleared her throat. "I'm glad you stayed." Tandri's breathing was slow and even, and Viv thought she might be asleep already. But then came a murmured reply. "I know." After that, for the first time in ages, Viv fell asleep almost instantly and did not wake up until morning. And they were roommates, and they were roommates. Okay. Chapter 24. When Viv's eyes opened, she could tell from the coldness behind her that Tandri had already risen. She was amazed she hadn't woken when the succubus left. Viv wouldn't have thought it possible. She smelled freshly brewed coffee and dressed slowly, needlessly delaying. Then she became annoyed with her own dithering. Before Tandri, she'd never been hesitant in her life. Was she really going to pick up the habit now? She descended the ladder with great deliberateness. Tandri sat at the big table, staring over the top of a mug that curled a ribbon of steam. As Viv joined her on the bench, the woman slid over another mug, still hot. "Thanks," murmured Viv. Tandri nodded and took a slow sip. There was a relaxed curve to Tandri's back, and her tail made slow, lazy motions behind her. Viv's tension released, and she swallowed some of the good, hot drink. The warmth of it settled into her whole body. A gabble of Thune's waking noises, muted by the walls of the shop, surrounded them peacefully. They enjoyed their coffee, slowly and quietly. Viv was reluctant to break the meditative mutual silence, but after dallying like a coward in the loft, she needed to act decisively. "Did you sleep all right?" As a bold conversational gambit, it left something to be desired. "I did." Floor notwithstanding, Viv smiled. "Someday I'll get around to that bed." "Okay, chat. I'm going to take a very quick water break because I have actually ran out of water. So I'll just be like 5 minutes. Give me a second." back with more water. Now, where were we? Okay. When they'd finished, Viv rummaged for cheese in the cold box and grabbed a few linen-wrapped pastries from the pantry. Tawdry joined her in the kitchen and they engaged in the well-worn routines of the morning, firing up the stove, lighting the lanterns and chandelier, filling the machine's oil reservoir, checking the cream and arranging the mugs. They picked out the food and moved about one another in a slow synchrony. Then Viv opened a door and the gentle spell was broken like a soap bubble. The noise of the day overtook them both, the murky threat of Venice receded, and the warm other place they'd occupied all morning became more and more dreamlike. The smells of Thimble's baking and the clatter of his cheerful labors filled up the kitchen as they greeted regulars. Chatter rumbled from the dining area, and the clink of mugs and plates skittered below it. Cal dropped by, and Viv showed him the stove she planned to order for Thimble. He read the measurements carefully and squinted at the wall and the stove, while Thimble rummaged in the pantry. Said Cal, stroking his chin with a thumb. Well, I suppose you could fit it in there, but going to be mighty crowded. Maybe it may be that you'd best make do with what you have. Auto circulator keeps up now, but with 2 fireboxes? Could be you're back where you started and sweating when you'd rather not. Might be you have to look for a bigger place and leave this one behind if you're set on it. That was frustrating, and of course moving wasn't an option. Viv glanced at the back room from which Thimble hadn't emerged. She didn't look forward to seeing his disappointment when she told him. That's a real shame, but I guess I have one other thing you might help with. Viv led Cal into the dining area. We've got a bar that comes in and plays back here. She gestured toward the far wall between the booths. I'm thinking maybe a little stage? Something higher up with a step. Sure, said Cal, happy to be able to agree to something. They talked details and he tipped his cap and went on his way, carrying a hot to-go mug and a thimblet with him. All too soon the day was done. We're not going to argue about the sleeping arrangements again, are we? Asked Tawdry artfully. Never let it be said that I don't learn from my mistakes. Tawdry hummed. Although maybe you can keep your tale to yourself this time. Viv smiled. Her back turned as she put away the last of the mugs. Tawdry laughed softly. Dinner? She asked, as though they often ate an evening meal together. Viv glanced over at Amity, curled up under the trestle table. For a wonder, the beast had stayed in the shop the whole day. It was reassuring. I should definitely eat something besides Thimble's baking, said Viv. She slapped her stomach. My clothes are feeling a little tight these days. Tawdry snorted and opened the door. They locked up and strolled to the high street, found a place that neither of them had visited before, and had a meal together. They talked about Laney's latest wheedling attempts to extract recipes from Thimble, how to break the news of the scuttled oven plans to their baker, and about Baldree and a few of his more ardent admirers. His biggest fan was back again yesterday, early, so she got a good seat. Observed Viv. The one with the hair? Tawdry gestured, miming wind-blown curls. Yep, that's the one. I don't think Pendry's noticed yet. Well, people tend to not notice what's in front of them until it nearly knocks them down. Viv was about to reply with an offhanded quip but something about Tandri's expression made her reevaluate. Eventually, she managed, I guess that's true. The conversation moved on. After dinner, the two of them returned to the shop and snuffed the lanterns and candles. The rumble of Amity's purr echoed from under the table. "I can't believe she's still here," said Tandri. "I'm sure she'll be gone before dawn." Viv hoped not, though. Maybe Cal will decide to sleep over too tomorrow. We're short of blankets, though. She waited for Tandri to ascend the ladder first. They revisited that serene, gentle quiet they briefly shared that morning and undressed. Viv found herself looking away as Tandri did. They fell asleep back to back, comfortable and easy and warm. Yowling shocked Viv awake, along with a heavy thud against her belly. Her eyes flew open as Amity's enormous skull butted her again. "What?" Tandri mumbled. "Get up." Viv sprang to her feet, inhaling deeply. There was a smell in the air she couldn't quite place, acrid, but still faint. The dire cat lashed her tail and paced anxiously on top of the ladder. Viv spared a thought for how impressive a leap that must have been. Then it dawned on her that she could see the animal far better than she should have been able to. At first she thought the faint light was from the moon, but the color was all wrong. It was a pale corpse fire green, and it was growing brighter. "What's that smell?" said Tandri as she snatched up her clothes and held them against her chest. Viv didn't bother with hers, nothing good. As she rushed to the ladder, the dire cat leapt down first. Viv grabbed the rafter and leaned out, grimacing when she saw tongues of spectral green flame licking at the frame of the double big doors and spreading fast. Strangely, there was almost no smoke. Then, with a thick, crackling sound, the flames sheeted up the doors like a waterfall in reverse. "Shit, hurry! It's fire! The bastard lit the building on fire! We have to put it out!" cried Tandri. Viv hoisted the woman off of her feet. Tandri gasped in surprise and almost dropped her clothes as Viv scooped her other arm under Tandri's legs and leapt to the floor below. Tandri grunted, rattled by the impact. Viv set her down and looked around the corner into the kitchen. That door was also aflame, and little ribbons of fire crept up the wall behind the stove and over toward the pantry. A piercing snap resounded from above as the pressure in the room changed, and the green poured across the ceiling like blood down a blade. She heard brittle, sharp cracks as the roof tiles burst like popping corn. "That isn't normal fire," said Tandri, raising her voice to be heard over the roar of the flames, her eyes wide and panicked. The normal fire smoked, but this one burned clean and pungent as incense. "It isn't. We have to get out of here now. We have to get you out of here now." "Me? What about us?" Amity yowled plaintively, then hissed like a tea kettle. She crouched near the big table, shying away from the showering sparks. Viv had already waited too long, much longer, and her options would dwindle to zero. There was no telling how hot this unnatural fire might burn or what might extinguish it, if, indeed, anything would. She dashed to the water barrel in the kitchen, the heat already intense from where the wall burned. The metal on the stove was beginning to throb red. Steam rose from the barrel, much hotter than a regular blaze. Viv scooped up a few of Thimble's mixing bowls, dredged them one by one through the water bucket, and tossed the water toward the front door, now alive with sheets of flame. The water had absolutely no effect. It hissed and evaporated before it even reached the wood, which had already charred, spiderwebbed with throbbing lines of orange. Shit. When Viv turned, she saw Tandri had discarded her clothes and gathered an armful of mugs. She opened them one by one at the front window, trying to shatter it, but the mugs burst on impact, leaving the glass unmarred. She turned to Viv. How do we get out? This way. Viv sprinted back to the dining area and the big double doors. The heavy wooden crossbeam still in place, snakes of green fire crawled all along its length, with curtains of flame dripping from above to meet those rising from the floor. Viv wrapped both arms around one of the big benches, lifted and heaved it over to the door, squinting against the heat's blinding intensity. She hooked one end of the bench under the burning crossbeam and jerked upward hard. The beam lurched, but fell back into its brackets, showering the floor in a spray of green sparks that skittered and hissed like water on a skillet. Several struck Viv's bare feet and arms, stinging like hornets. The pain was incandescent, and she smelled her own flesh charring. She heaved upward once again. Twice, and on the third attempt, the cross beam was bashed free and slammed to the flagstones, along with another cascade of green sparks. "Stand back," shouted Viv. She adjusted her grip toward the center of the bench, lifted it fully, then charged forward, hammering into the right-hand door and continuing past, leaping over the fallen beam. A rush of cool night air met her, and she let the bench carry her forward out of the shop, where she hurled it away. It rolled and clattered into the street, where she could already see the shadows of neighbors emerging. Viv turned and saw Tandri framed in the hellish green window, the flames from the fallen crossbeam leaping higher. A shadow to Tandri's right materialized and launched itself through the flames. Amity landed in a smoking sprawl on the cobbles. She spared them a brief, terrified glance, then fled down an alley. Viv's gaze snapped back to Tandri. The woman held one arm, grimacing in pain, tears streaking down her cheeks. Taking a deep breath, Viv sprinted back into the building, leaping through the flames, which seemed almost liquid as she passed through, like boiling water. And then she was inside. Hauling Tandri into her arms again, Viv dove back through the green wall of heat. "Stay here," she said, depositing Tandri in the street. When she turned back, the entire building was engulfed, the fire spreading with supernatural speed across every surface. She winced at the sharper parts of more roof tiles popping and clay shards rained down, peppering onlookers with fragments and dust. "You can't go back in there," Tandri yelled over the rushing howl of flames. Viv sucked in a lungful of air and charged back into the building. She could smell her hair smoldering as she landed inside. Viv spared a glance for the flagstone under the table. Something seemed wrong. Was it tilted out of place? No time for that, not now. She scrambled for the kitchen, vaulting the countertop. The pantry boiled with flames behind her, heat pressing on her like a physical thing. She yanked the lockbox out and slammed it onto the counter. She leapt over again and tucked it under an arm in a single motion, then sprinted for the doors. With a roar, she hurled it out into the street, trying her best to aim away from where she thought Tandri was staying. It struck on a corner with an ominous crack and tumbled, but blessedly held. She rushed back to the kitchen. Viv spared a glance for black blood on the wall, with garlands already a glowing ruin of cinders. Then she heaved the coffee machine off the counter with both hands and walked deliberately back toward the open door. Sparks from above peppered her shoulders, her hair little lightning strikes of pain. Part of her braid caught fire, and she couldn't spare a hand to put it out. She grimly advanced, muscles straining under the awkward load. She came to a stop in front of the flaming crossbeam and wished she'd had the presence of mind to shove it aside with the bench to clear a path. But it was too late for that now. Too late for anything else. She took one enormous leap over the burning beam, holding the machine before her. Fire licked her thighs, cooking her skin, the pain exquisite along both legs, and then she was over. Staggering into the street, Viv gently set it down and groaned. Her back shrieked in agony, a pain she hadn't known for weeks. As she turned back toward the building, the lintels above the big doors collapsed, and the doors themselves folded inwards in a huge gout of green, landing with a booming sound of explosives. The mullioned window exploded outward in chunks of needles and glass. Everyone shielded their faces with their arms. They stood, stunned in the street, baking in the heat rippling from the building. The roof began to creak and snap, and in a shuddering slope it collapsed, tiles pouring into the room below. Where they glowed bright red in the pools of green flame. Standing in their small clothes beside the tumbled lockbox and the coffee maker, Tandri's hand found Viv's and gripped it tight. She coughed, eyes watering. Viv stared into the shop, her face set. The big table began to sag to the side, half buried under cherry-bright tiles, to crumble over the place where the scoured stone lay. She squeezed Tandri's hand back. At least we didn't lose everything. Tandri looked bleakly at the machine and the lockbox. You shouldn't have risked it. Following her gaze, Viv turned fully to Tandri and leaned down until their foreheads met, shoulders slumping under the weight of loss and terror and exhaustion. In a low voice, so low she was sure Tandri wouldn't hear it over the roar of the flames, the rising clamor of people, and the ringing of watch bells, she murmured, "That wasn't what I meant." Damn, that was a really intense chapter. We're already in chapter 25, which leaves us with about... We could technically finish this tonight. Let's see. Gate wardens appeared. Where was I? Chapter 25. Gate wardens appeared soon after the blaze began, lanterns in hand, and bellowed at the growing crowd in the street. Viv only dimly registered their presence until one of them approached, directed to her by some neighbor. She numbly answered his questions and forgot her answers almost immediately. When he disappeared, she turned her attention to the wreckage. Ignomancers from acres, recognizable by their robes and pins and air of scholarly alliance, were able to contain the spectral flames and prevent the spread to the neighboring structures. But there was nothing they could do that would have changed the outcome for the shop itself, so they let it burn. The flames raged nearly until dawn, and Viv and Tandri remained in the street, watching the shop reduced to cinders. The walls collapsed and fell in fits and starts, a slow crumbling, and a sudden rush, as timbers tumbled inward in a corkscrew ribbon of sparks. Tandri huddled by Viv's side. They were blasted dry, like they'd been scoured by a desert wind. The skin of Viv's face was raw, the burn on her thighs angry and throbbing. Lainey hobbled over to them at some point, bringing blankets to cover up with. It was too hot, and Viv shed hers almost immediately, although Tandri kept one wrapped around her shoulders, held together in front with a fist. By degrees, Tandri slumped against Viv's arm, exhausted. The succubus did suggest they leave, but she did murmur at some point, "When you're ready, we'll stay at my place." Viv couldn't bring herself to acknowledge the offer. Despite the heat on her flesh, a coldness drew down from Viv's skull to the soles of her feet. Like every day she'd spent in Thule was leeching away, or leaking away, rather, leaving a growing emptiness, the most physical manifestation of despair she had ever known. Was this what Tandri had spoken of? What had she called it? Arcane reciprocity? Is this what it felt like? Was this just plain old everyday hopelessness? And she didn't know. And she supposed it didn't matter. Tandri tried once more, still indirect. "Aren't you tired?" Her voice was hoarse. While the smoke from the spectral flames had been sparse, her throat still burned from it. "I can't leave," said Viv. "Not yet." Her eyes stayed fixed on the place in the heart of the ebbing destruction where the stone once rested. She had to know if it was still there. As dawn glimmered, the green flames sputtered and died, as if they fed on the night as much as on earthly fuel. The heat was still intolerable, though, and the blackened spars and charred and glowing tile could not be approached. Eventually, Tandri persuaded Viv to sit on Laney's stoop, and together they watched the dawn bloom fully. Now the blackened wood did smoke in a more natural way, as though the arcane fire hadn't consumed it until then. A black, noxious cloud of soot grew and spiraled skyward, where it was torn apart and scattered by a breeze from the direction of the river. Laney stood behind them, leaning on her broom. After a while, Viv asked in a ragged voice, "Laney, do you have a bucket or two you'd lend?" The old woman did, and Viv took one in each hand. Still barefoot and in her undershirt and short linen pants, she strode to the well, filled them both, and grimly tossed water onto the ashes of the space where the big doors had once been. It splashed and hissed now, without the green flames to burn it away before it could fall. She took buckets back to the well, refilled them, and did it again, and again, and again, forging slowly inward toward the ruin that had once been the big table. Viv didn't count the trips, and her feet left bloody prints on the cobbles. Ashes kicked her legs up to her stinging thighs. Tandri waited on the stoop and didn't try to dissuade her. It would have been pointless. The heat was still intense, and sometimes Viv poured the bucket over herself before she returned. The water always wicked away soon after she retraversed the spattered trail she was blazing. At every splash, the ashes became briefly muddy until the blackness quickly dried and cracked again. In the street, the crowds had thinned some, although the murmuring onlookers that remained stayed far away from Viv as she deliberately forged ever inward. Sometimes, during this numb repetition, Tandri briefly disappeared and returned with Cal in a small wagon driven by a sturdy pony, rather. They enlisted the help of some nearby folk and loaded the coffee machine and the lockbox into the wagon, and Cal took it away again. Viv hardly cared. At last she reached the place. Barely any wood remained on the table, and what did was powdery and burnt through in a patchwork. The first bucket of water that struck it made it wither and crumble away like salt. Viv knelt and pawed away at the ruin, her fingers scorched by embers hiding beneath. She stood and kicked the cinders with her bloody feet until the flagstone beneath was exposed. She breathed heavily, inhaling smoke, coughing raggedly, staring at it. One more trip with the buckets washed away some of the accumulated ash and cooled the surface of the stone. She took a blackened twist of metal and levered up the edge, flipping it into the crumbled remains of the table in a plume of grey. Dropping to her knees, Viv sorted through the startlingly hot earth beneath her scorched fingers. And there was, of course, nothing there. When Viv returned to the street, she moved as though underwater, weightless, sound distorted and far away. She stared bleakly at Tandri and stumbled toward her. Before she reached Laney's stoop, Viv was surprised to see Lack shoulder past the people fringing in the street. He carried folded sets of clothing and 2 pairs of cloth shoes. He said nothing when he passed the bundles to Viv and Tandri. But Viv saw the flash of a fine grey dress between a few of the folk behind him. The madrigal caught her gaze, nodded solemnly, and then walked away down the street, stately and unhurriedly. "Thank you," managed Tandri in her cracked voice, but it was all Viv could do to reach out and take what Lakov offered without dropping it. Lack murmured something to them that Viv didn't register, and then she stood staring at the clothes with only dim comprehension. After that, Viv didn't remember sitting, but she must have done so at some point. She stared dully ahead, vision blurred as her eyes watered from the smoke. A familiar voice whispered, "Oh no." Viv blinked in recognition. She turned her head and squinted at the unfocused shape of Thimble. Tandri knelt before him in quiet conference, with Laney's blanket puddling around her. Viv closed her eyes, and when next they opened, he was gone, and she didn't know how much time had passed. Tandri was suddenly beside her again. "He's here." She gently put a hand on Viv's shoulder and turned her, and there came Cal, again, with a pony and a wagon. Tandri led her to it and gently urged her into the back, where Viv lay with feet dangling off the boards, staring up at the sky and the black ribbon of smoke that bisected it. She distantly heard Cal and Tandri speaking on the buckboard as the cart clattered away over the cobbles. The smell of the burnt shop receded a little, but never completely. Viv reeked of it. The ashes fluttered away from her in the breeze of their passage, like snow blown upward. At last, the wagon stopped, and someone guided her up some stairs. And then she was inside Tandri's room. The woman sat her in a wooden chair that creaked under her weight. Tandri disappeared, only to return with a wet towel. She scrubbed Viv as gently as she could manage, although the nap of the cloth was like sandpaper where she was burned, which was almost everywhere. Afterward, Tandri managed to get her undressed into the clean clothes that Lack had provided, and then settled her into the lone bed in the room. Viv resisted closing her eyes, resisted letting go of consciousness, but the next time she blinked, she was gone into a dreamless black. When she slowly woke, Viv felt more present in her own body, but her bleakness had redoubled. Her eyes flickered open, and the blanket of Tandri's bed rasped against her skin, painful on her burns. At first, she closed her eyes again, craving the oblivion of sleep, but it eluded her. "You're awake," said Tandri. Viv turned her head, and the muscles on her neck ached. All of her ached. Her feet sizzled with pain. Tawdry was seated in a chair with a blanket pulled up to her chin. Her eyes looked bruised, hair singed. The tracks of tear were still clear on her smudged cheeks. The smell of fire filled the room. They were both still redolent of it. Yeah, whispered Viv. She didn't think she could manage more than that. She realized how parched she was, and that was something tangible. She needed water. Tandri seemed to sense it. She stood and shuffled in her blanket over to the vanity and brought a full pitcher. Viv managed to prop herself up and drink it all greedily in a few enormous gulps. "Thank you," she said, not even bothering to wipe the wetness from her chin. There was icy relief on her tender skin, and then she felt it needed to be said. "I'm sorry." "For what?" Tandri frowned at her in a tired way. "Saving me from the fire, the one I was such a big help at preventing. I guess we should both be thanking the cat." Tandri chuckled soundlessly at that, although it looked like it hurt. "I have to go back," said Viv. "Now? Why? Whatever it is, it'll keep. There's nothing there to recover. There's just something else I have to see." Tandri stared at her, and sighed and shrugged. "Let's go then." "You should sleep. I kept you out of your bed." "I couldn't sleep without knowing where you were anyway," replied Tandri. "Sleep will keep too, I suppose." Viv groaned as she sat fully upright, pushed herself to her feet, and then found and slipped into the cloth shoes that the madrigal had provided. She hissed through her teeth as her soles protested, but she mastered herself. Outside Tandri's room, she saw it was late afternoon, tending toward dusk. She must have slept for 7 or 8 hours. The walk back to the shop was very slow, and she stepped carefully. Pain that she had shrugged off hours ago became insistent and sharp. She thought about what Tandri had said just a day ago about reciprocity. Pain that was ignored, magnified on its return. Absolute devastation. The heat had died down a great deal over the course of the day, although it was still uncomfortably warm. No walls stood. Hills of ash and the stubs of burnt spars and tumbled stone marked the perimeter. The slumped piles of grey and black resembled a blurry map of what had once been the interior. Viv left Tandri in the street and waded in, carefully choosing her steps. She made her way behind where the counter had once stood and cast her gaze over the wreckage there. At last, she found it. Viv tentatively reached out, careful of potential heat, but it was cooler than she expected. She withdrew black blood from the pile, and black grit sifted away from its warped, tortured length. The leather that had bound the grip was, of course, burnt away to the tang. Crossguard was curved and melted, and the blade twisted, and a mother-pearl sheen rippled across it like oil. A crack ran from one side all the way down to the fuller, the steel destroyed by the incredible heat of the unnatural fire. Viv held her sword in both hands, head bowed. She'd forsworn her old life, crossing a bridge to a new land, and now knelt in its ruin. This was the bridge burning away behind her, leaving her in a desolation. She tossed the blade back into the ash and took the only path that remained. Okay. That was a very intense chapter, chat. I think that is where we can call it a night. I do have to kind of get back into the swing of things here with, reading and such. So I won't be pushing my voice too much. But yeah, to those who stayed and dropped on by, once again, thank you for swinging on by the Chipped Cup Cafe, the place you end up when you don't really know where you're headed. I was your host, Moka Kahvesi, and I hope you have a good day, afternoon, or night. Goodbye now.